If someone just acquires property and starts a child slave farm, well, I'm sorry, we don't just say, oh, well, they're on their own property. You still have the right to go in and stop violations of rights no matter where they're occurring, in my view.
You sound like Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble, Austin.
Yeah, well, that's what I like to do.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Clair.
Welcome back to my friends, my enemies, my compatriots, my companions, and whoever just might have stumbled upon this show. This is the Lions of Liberty podcast. This is episode number 120. You can find the show notes for the show at lionsofliberty.com/120. Today's show is sponsored by Health Excellence Select. If you are sick and tired of dealing with your Obamacare insurance, you need to look into Health Excellence Select and the amazing concept of health sharing. For more information, head over to lionsofliberty.com/health. We are also sponsored today by libertymaniacs.com, your one-stop shop for political and satirical apparel and merchandise. As a listener of this program, you can receive a 10% discount on your entire order by using discount code Lions of Liberty at checkout. So head on over to libertymaniacs.com and express your inner Liberty Maniac. My guest today is a former producer for Freedom Watch with Judge Andrew Napolitano, probably the last cable news program I watched regularly before its cancellation. He is now the editor-in-chief of the libertarianrepublic.com as well as libertyviral.com and the host of the Freedom Report podcast, Austin Petersen. Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Well, Austin, it's great to have you here, and it's no secret that you like to sort of rile folks up. Poke the bear, if you will, in the liberty movement. And nothing really seems to poke the bears more on every side of the discussion than the dreaded minarchy versus anarchy debate. You recently had a lengthy conversation with Tom Woods on this subject. And we're going to spend a little time today discussing why you take the minarchist position in that debate. But first, I want to get to know you a little bit better. So why don't you tell us how you first got interested in the ideas of liberty?
Well, I first got interested as a young boy because I was raised on a farm in Missouri. So I grew up and was raised culturally conservative, socially conservative, and fiscally conservative. And I maintained those values until I hit puberty, and then things got a little sexy. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm not quite socially conservative anymore. I'm a little bit more tolerant, perhaps. I'm a little bit more sex, drugs, and rock and roll than I had expected. Perhaps my parents wished at the time. So with socially liberal values and with fiscally conservative values that I never abandoned, I looked at myself and said, why am I such a freak? Why am I all alone in the world with no one who thinks or feels the way that I do? I feel like a conservative around liberals and a liberal around conservatives. What's wrong with me? Is there anything that I can take that could solve my problem? And then I started reading books. It started with Ayn Rand. I went from there to Ron Paul, and from Ron Paul, the explosion of knowledge began, where I began to read Henry Hazlitt, von Mises, Rothbard, Hayek, and my favorite, Robert Nozick, and my beliefs started to blossom from there.
It's kind of that standard path a lot of people take where we realize our political beliefs don't really fit into the standard paradigm, but we don't have a label to put on it. We don't really have a direction to go. And then someone kind of sets that spark, whether it's Ron Paul or whether you pick up a book by Hayek, Rothbard, or whoever, and that really helps you focus. And even if you don't agree with everyone you're reading along the way, it really helps you see that there is an actual set of beliefs that are at least discussing these ideas that at least it does fit into in some way. Now, tell us a little bit about your time working with Judge Napolitano. How did you end up landing that gig? How did you end up getting in there with Fox News? And what was it like working at Fox News, working in essentially what many people revert to as the corporate media?
Right. Well, I'll tell you the truth is that it takes a long time to become an overnight success, man, because it took me a year and a half to wrangle that job at Fox. And when I was working in 2008, I got a job at the Libertarian Party. And then in 2009, I worked for an international think tank called Atlas. But during that time, the judge had his podcast on Fox. He wanted his own show. He didn't know who I was, but I had read all of his books. And so what I did was I contacted the judge, sent him an email just directly and said, hey, I would like to help you get your own show. What can I do? And he goes, well, I have no idea. You young people, come up with some creative idea. And that was before Facebook and Twitter were really a big deal. This was 2007, 2008. So because Ron Paul had all these huge meetup groups, and there was this giant libertarian movement that had coalesced behind Dr. Paul, and his presidential run was over. I harnessed the energy that was the unused energy of the movement at the time and put everything I could into getting the judge his own show. And I was basically a traffic driver. So whenever the judge would have his show, I would coordinate online with everyone to help drive traffic to that show so that Fox would actually consider giving his own show. And I had a team of interns that I brought together, and I put them all on an enormous research project. We put together a 30-page report pulling from Cato Institute and other media sources that we showed how big the libertarian audience is in the United States. And we submitted that research report, gave it to the judge. The judge took it to Roger Ailes' office. Roger Ailes said, "This is brilliant." And the judge turned around and said, "Okay, Austin, if I get this show, you'll be the first person I hire." And that ended up being the case. I mean, there were a lot more steps in there. I had to go through an interview process. The whole idea behind the corporate media, of course, especially television, is to keep you out if you've never worked in it before. So the only way that I was able to get that job is because the judge demanded that no one be hired until I was hired. And so the talent usually gets what they want, and that's how I was able to break in.
Awesome. That's really fascinating. And it's a real lesson anybody can take that might think, oh, I can't accomplish this or that because, I mean, essentially there was no way you could just start a show and produce a show at Fox News in theory, but you saw a need for it, you saw a vision for it, and you just went out and hustled and made it happen. And that's something anybody can take a lesson from for anything they want to do in life, not just expanding the ideas of liberty or that kind of thing. And what kind of observations can you kind of pass along to us from how you saw things operate at Fox News? Obviously, you guys had a pretty decent level of freedom with the show, at least while it was on, but I'm sure there must have been some kind of headbutting ideologically that went on in the back room with a lot of the other talking heads there. At least I imagine so.
Yes and no. I learned a lot, actually, about how journalism works, and I actually gained a greater respect for my colleagues at Fox while I was there, and it made me a better journalist. It made me a better person because as libertarians, we tend to be like other inside groups, and we have a fear and a hatred of the other. So anybody who's not in our group, like liberals or neocons, which, by the way, most of the staff at Fox are liberals. Like almost all of Bill O'Reilly's staff are liberals, and the only staff that was mostly all libertarians, of course, was the judge's show and then John Stossel's show. Otherwise, it didn't matter as long as they could do the work. The thing that I learned while I was there too is that like mistakes such as Rand Paul not being included in a poll. Libertarians freak out and they say, they don't want to include him, blah, blah, blah. But I'll tell you, there's some idiots that work there and they probably made a mistake. Those things happen all the time. But then the problem is that as libertarians, we tend to have a little bit more we have a very distrustful kind of skeptical outlook on things. And we've been screwed by the media before, legitimately. And what happens is that we automatically assume that it's all part of the big media conspiracy to shut us out. What we don't realize as libertarians, what people don't want to realize as libertarians, what libertarians do not want to see is the truth, is that the problem is not the media. The problem is that the people demand the type of media that they get. The media is a reflection of ourselves as a culture in some sense. And I actually got a lot of trouble because I was on Russia Today several times and I learned a lot about them. And libertarians love Russia Today because I think that a lot of libertarians, we tend to be brainwashed like other group organizations. We are the cult of individualists who must all think alike. I think a lot of us have problems with. So a lot of libertarians trust Russia Today over Fox News, despite the fact that Russia Today is a Kremlin-funded propaganda outlet from a government. And Fox News runs as a free market institution dedicated to serving their customer base. So what did I learn? I learned a lot of things that I thought were, that were problems with the system, but also a lot of problems with the libertarian, not philosophy, but the outlook and approach to dealing with our philosophy when the rubber hits the road.
Well, sure, there's often that knee-jerk reaction in libertarian circles. Whenever anything looks like it could maybe be shady, they jump to the conclusion of, well, it must be the corporate conspiracy or it must be a government conspiracy when, and there certainly are those conspiracies sometimes, but
sure.
A lot of these things can be chalked up to pure incompetence. Libertarians always like to talk about the incompetence of government, and yet somehow they believe every single thing is a giant plan to really screw us all over. And sometimes it might be, but we have to actually do some research into things and think things through through and not just have a knee-jerk reaction and call everything a conspiracy. And you had a really interesting observation there when you mentioned how you kind of get the media we deserve as a society. I mean, it's not Fox News gets ratings. That's why they produce the programming they produce. And in many ways, that kind of relates to our government. I mean, everyone's always angry at the state and the state doing this, the state doing that. But in many ways, the state is a reflection of what society wants at large. And that's kind of where we need to start. That's where we need to address things with our fellow man, not just generically lash our anger out at the government and anything they may or may not do. So, Austin, let's get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty here, the stuff that people really want to hear about. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, you had quite an interesting discussion with Tom Woods, a former guest on this show, regarding the anarchy versus minarchy debate, which never seems to end. And you do take the side of minarchy in this conversation. I like to keep this program, it can be a very difficult line to cross, but I like to keep this program somewhat accessible to people who are kind of new to these ideas and not necessarily blow them all away, but we probably will do that eventually here. But why don't we just try to stick to the basics in the beginning here? So why don't you just explain exactly what minarchy is to you, and why do you label yourself a minarchist as opposed to an anarchist, which many libertarians such as Tom Woods identify themselves as?
Well, Tom Woods even says that he has some problems with anarchist philosophy and some things that don't satisfy him when it comes to anarchist philosophy. I just happen to take it a step further and say that those reasons justify not embracing it in entirety, simply because like I said to Tom, anarchists replace government with governments that you don't call government. And I used to be an anarchist, but there's too many rules. The problem with anarchy is that there are a lot of rules that you have to follow, and of course, if you don't follow them, there are going to be consequences. The problem is that most anarchists are like, well, if you steal a stick of gum, I can shoot you in the face, or if a Girl Scout trespasses on my property, then there'll be a landmine there to blow her up. And then Tom Woods says, that's ridiculous, that's a straw man. Why can't there be proportionality? Well, the problem with proportionality is my proportionality is not the same as your proportionality. And vigilante justice, I'm sorry, but I don't think most people want to see vigilante justice on every single crime committed. If that were the case, well then, all of the egregious crimes that are committed by police against minorities that libertarians decry will happen on either the same scale or greater by the same racist people who will take those positions up in private institutions and inflict their racism, and libertarians will be fine with it as long as it's done by a private institution. So there's no sense of justice in an anarchic society. There's no sense of understanding of reciprocity, and there's no definition of what is proportional in terms of violence. So to me, I think that the anarchist argument falls apart, especially when you take a look at Robert Nozick and the way he defined a state, a minarchist state, the night watchman state. To me, a night watchman state is much less complicated than an anarchy, because in an anarchy, you'd have so many different communes, like Hans Hermann Hoppe described in his books on democracy. You would have way more governments. Again, they are governments. Anything that has that authority to use coercive force, you don't have to call it a government, but it has the same effect as government. And so the idea is to limit government, not create new ones.
When you say a government that has the authority to use coercive force, where do you see that authority coming from? Does it have to emanate from consent of the governed? Because, listening to your interview with Tom Woods, even a half hour into it, neither of you had mentioned the idea of consent of the governed. So, where does that play in?
Only to a small extent. Only on a small extent. You need to have the consent of the governed to a certain extent. Not everyone can consent to be governed. Anarchists think that because they are of sound faculty and of sound mind, that other people are of sound faculty and mind as well, and that's not the case. The reality is that some people are born without sound faculties or sound mind, meaning that even Friedrich von Hayek, who argued for a social safety net, and I disagree with him on that, and there are some libertarians even who talk about minimum basic guaranteed incomes, and I don't go that far. But the reality is that some people are born with mental defects. They are born psychopaths, they are born sociopaths, and then the anarchist says, oh, well, those are the people who try and get into government. Yes, well, the point is that with a government limited in power, you limit the ambitions of the sociopaths. In a free market, Hillary Clinton can have all the nuclear weapons she wants. Jeb Bush can have all the nuclear weapons he wants, as long as they're private, as long as it's private, right? No. The idea is that we must limit power, and we need coercive force to restrain people's ambitions against one another. And, you've got to read game theory from John Nash. You have to understand how people play against one another. You have to, look at the tactics that social democrats use to grow government in order to understand how government grows. And to me, consent of the governed, again, maybe you should have to be a taxpayer to vote. Maybe you should have to own some land to vote. I mean, maybe you should have some sort of a barrier to entry. And to me, we already have that. We have representative democracy. So you don't actually vote for the president. You don't actually vote for certain aspects of this democracy. You vote for an elector, right? Somebody to vote on your behalf, because the founders knew that people were stupid and that people were not always in command of their faculties. So an adversarial system of representative democracy and a constitutionally limited government, to me, is the way to go.
Let's try to parse down some of these principles a little bit. And, many libertarians, as you know, hold dear something called the non-aggression principle, the idea that one should not initiate force against their fellow man. Now, in the Tom Woods interview, you criticized this principle, so I just want to be more clear on that. Are you opposed to the actual concept of the principle, or is your criticism more in sort of making it the central defining aspect of libertarianism?
Yes, I do have a problem with it being the central defining aspect of libertarianism. It's fine, no problem to teach the non-aggression principle to children. And anarchists generally have the mindset of children because they cannot possibly deal with ultra complex issues such as foreign policy, for the most part, how to deal with foreign policy or foreign trade. They have a mindset of a child. You have to keep the non-aggression principle as the centerpiece of libertarianism if you are of a black or white thinking, a unitary mindset, because the non-aggression principle is something that you teach to a child. Okay, and then you start to get into higher order of principles. Non-aggression principle falls apart when faced with almost any conflict outside of a schoolyard, whether it be a conflict over property rights, whether it's a simple conflict of, let's say you are in a battle defending your life and you accidentally shoot an innocent bystander. There's collateral damage involved there, but you are simply defending your own life. And so the non-aggression principle is an attempt to, I think, infantilize libertarian ideas and to keep it simple for the stupids. And that's why I do talk down to these people, because for the most part, most of the anarchists aren't people like Hans Hermann Hoppe or Murray Rothbard, for example. The disgusting rabble of the anarcho-capitalist movement today will get nothing accomplished because these effete, pseudo-intellectual, ineffective, basement-dwelling neckbeards have no political power. They have zero political power. They have zero social power. And they cannot get their principles enacted because, number one, their principles fall apart when met with the most rudimentary moral and logical problems that exist in the real world, and two, because they do not have enough social power to be able to convince their fellow citizens of the superiority of those principles.
So you basically see the non-aggression principle as essentially not a bad concept, but an oversimplification of how things play out in real life. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And also I'm disparaging the character of the people who mostly hold this principle as well. I'm disparaging their character and their philosophy.
Do you think that more of the problem is really just the definition of aggression? Because if we're only saying non-aggression principle, well then, all right, so what's aggression? And maybe the idea is we just need to further define aggression. I mean, one example you guys use is the example that Rothbard used, which I couldn't disagree with more, the idea that, a parent is not obligated to feed a child. And therefore, I guess the baby can just wither away and die if that's okay. But to me, that is actually aggression, because if you're putting a human being in a position to rely on you, which you are if you're giving birth to them, and you're not at least making an arrangement for someone else to feed them, or the hot air balloon example, if I bring someone up in my hot air balloon, they're putting in themselves, or I'm putting them in a position to rely on me. So then if I take another action which harms them, whether that be refuse to feed them or toss them off my hot air balloon, I am committing an act of aggression. So I think you're right in the sense we can't just go around pouting and saying non-aggression principle, because there is nuance in the world and we need to look at the nuance of each situation. But I mean, I still don't, do you disagree with the actual principle at hand? I mean, I know you said you don't, but do you see a situation where aggression is justified, I guess is what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the thing. So there's a lot to suss out there. Here at its base. So let's say you and I disagree on what is aggression. Who's responsible with deciding what is aggression, right? So the problem here is that there's no authority, and it does. I'm not saying that there has to be a government authority, of course, defining what aggression is. I think that that's probably the most superior method, but certainly I would listen to any anarchist with a superior system. But when it comes to the definition of aggression, we as when it comes to like the universal serial bus, the USB cable that my microphone is plugged into my computer with, we did not need the government to create the protocol that set the standard all the way across the industry. That naturally arose as a part of the free market. Understandable. But when you're dealing with something more complex, such as actual physical interactions or violent interactions between human beings, that's when the marketplace is not going to arise a solution that both parties can agree on. And let me tell you why. Because there is no such thing as a neutral third-party arbiter in a free market when it comes to violence. The reason is because in a civic system where there are laws, where you have some form of a court system, right? That whoever is getting paid, if you're paying for the court, whoever's paying for the court is going to have a natural bias towards. And so the reason why we have a court system set up such as we do is because it is supposed to, I say quote unquote, supposed to act as a neutral third party arbiter. Because in order for you or I to resolve a dispute, you and I are going to have to go to a neutral third party. And sometimes I can't afford to pay for a lawyer if you're accusing me of a crime. You can accuse me of a crime also as many times as you want and basically put me out of business. Or you could put me in prison because you say you accuse me of murdering someone and I have no civil right against double jeopardy. Now, I was wrong in the debate with Tom Woods when I said that lawyers were a natural right. I should have said that lawyers were a civil right. And there are natural rights and there are civil rights. So do we really want to return to a state of nature? And if so, why don't the anarchists just go live out in the woods and be hippies? Why don't they just go live in the state of nature? I would prefer to live in a civic organization, a civil society that has certain civil rights. The problem with anarchists, of course, is that there has been no explanation for how civil rights would be afforded, because anarchists only look at natural rights as negative rights, and they say there are no other rights. Well, I'm sorry, but there are such a thing as civil rights. And if you don't recognize that, well, then you do need to eject yourself from society.
I'm glad you make that distinction between natural rights and civil rights, because there is a distinction to be made. Because to me, a natural right is basically just only discussing the realm of negative rights in terms of, it's describing what cannot be done to you, an aggression that cannot be inflicted upon another person. You have the right to your property, a right to your life, and that right should not be inflicted upon by anyone. And then we have civil rights, which are essentially man-made constructs, and men should have the right to sort of create agreements based on certain things, like saying, if you live in our society, if you live in our community, you're protected from double jeopardy. You cannot be accused of the same crime over and over, just for one example, or you have a right to a jury trial. Now, we have to differentiate that, in my view, from natural rights, because if we say everyone has a right to, say, a lawyer or, say, a jury, well, now if no one wants to serve on that jury, or someone doesn't want to be your lawyer, well, now if it's a right, we have to force someone to be that attorney or force someone to be on that jury.
No, you don't.
All right, so tell us why.
You don't. Because you don't force someone to be a lawyer. People get paid to be lawyers, and that's ridiculous to think that, you have to force someone to be a lawyer. Yes, there's the whole island idea that, how do you have a right to a lawyer if there's only two of us on an island? Well, we're talking about civilization. Three people in a civil society, three people make society. And so a third party wouldn't be forced to arbitrate a dispute in such a situation, but they could be paid to arbitrate a dispute. And what was the other one that you mentioned?
Juries.
Okay, yeah. So nobody is forced to be a juror, right? You know how you get required to be a juror? You vote. So don't vote.
So what about a case where, say, someone cannot afford a lawyer, or there's no lawyer that will take their case on the free market or what have you? I mean, do you justify, I guess, confiscating funds from other people in the community, or just taxing? I don't want to say confiscating, but whatever taxation scheme there might be, can you justify that in order to hire a lawyer for someone that cannot get one on their own?
Yeah, of course, you can justify taxes.
How do we parlay that into rights? I mean, where do you make that distinction between natural rights and what you call civil rights?
Well, a natural right is something that is innate, and usually those are defined as negative rights, rights that you can initiate without any requirement placed on any other people, no positive obligations placed on someone else. But a civil right does sometimes require, it does become a positive right, and if you it depends on if you have a court system that can prosecute you, well, then you have a civil right to a lawyer. And of course, there would be lawyers in that kind of an institution, a system of law. So there would be plenty of opportunities for people to represent you. So I think it's sort of, I don't know, it's kind of a red herring here to say that that you're going to have to force a lawyer. Like, when has a lawyer ever turned down a paying job? I think maybe that's happened once in history, but I certainly can't think of anything.
Well, what if someone doesn't have any money to pay them? I mean, what if someone is literally broke and no one wants to take their case?
Right. So honestly, the best way for a system of taxation to work is to work on the most voluntary basis. At the Libertarian Republic, we have an article that's called 6 Ways to Fund Services in a Libertarian Republic. And those are we attempt to lay out the least coercive methods of taxation: tolls, fines, fees, lotteries, sales taxes. Those are the least coercive forms of taxation. There are problems with those forms of taxation, but you're not going to solve the problems by not proposing any new solutions. Of course, I know how annoyed people would be if they had to pay a toll every time they went on somebody else's property, and people are not going to vote for that kind of system, but it's certainly more voluntary because it gives private property owners more authority, sovereignty over their own property. So, there would be, of course, no eminent domain whatsoever, and that would mean that, certain roads would not be built because certain people would just simply refuse to allow a highway to go through. And so, unfortunately, you do have to have some form of taxation, and that form of taxation should be the most voluntary possible. I vote for a lottery. I vote for lotteries. I vote for sales taxes because sales taxes are non-coercive in the sense that you don't have to buy anything, just like you don't have to vote and be a lawyer. In some sense, once you begin participating in an activity, there needs to be a cost that you bear on that. For example, if you purchase a Chinese coin, or if you purchase like a Chinese Hello Kitty doll or a Japanese Hello Kitty doll, for example, there probably is going to be a tax on that.
What do you mean if?
Okay, right. So if you import something from Japan, you're going to have to pay a fee, and if there's a private institution that runs the port, you're going to have to pay a port fee, right? So you're going to pay the fee either way. So it can either be through the government or it can be through the private institution. In most sense, I'll go for the private institution, but you're still going to pay. If you want to have a civil system, and you want to participate in the civilization such as we have now, which I really don't know anybody that wants to return to a state of nature other than the most extreme radical hippie anarchists, in which case, I invite them to do so. And you can see them trying to do that, like in Liberland, for example, or like they tried to go in the Honduras, and for example, and I'm all for it, secede as far as you can go. But if you want to live in civil society, in civilization, then you're going to have to understand we have a system of natural rights and civil rights, and those do require some obligations on your behalf.
So, Austin, you mentioned secession there. Now, do you believe that U.S. states should or do have the right to secede from the U.S. government?
No.
Why is that?
Absolutely not. Because the Constitution of the United States says that the federal government is required to guarantee a Republican form of government in all of the states. And so if those states were to secede, then the federal government couldn't do its job. And because I like the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment that guarantees the privileges and immunities, which has been a little bit defanged, of course. The 14th Amendment is the post-civil, right after Civil War amendment. But it's a very libertarian amendment. And I would like to see more decentralization, but not secession, because again, if a state secedes, voluntarily, that seems like to be one thing. But the problem with that is, of course, if 51% of the people in the state vote to secede, well, then you're forcing 49% of the people who live there to do something that you're coercing those 49% of people, and so that's really what becomes a problem. So it's not legal for the states of the United States to secede. The only way to make it legal would be through force of arms. And I don't see that as advancing liberty in any sense whatsoever. In what sense would any state secede for the purpose of granting more liberty in the United States? And don't even say Texas, because I guarantee you the first thing they're going to do is keep out Mexicans, crack down on every other on marijuana and drug users, and start executing somebody every other hour. I like the federal system because what it does is it provides a check and balance on state power. Because a state can be just as tyrannical as the federal government, as we've seen in Jim Crow and as we've seen in many other problems across the United States. So no, I don't think secession in the United States is legal, and I don't say that secession as a whole is immoral, but simply in this point in time in history that this is not the time for secession.
So you had mentioned earlier, kind of when referring to like Liberland and places like that are trying to start their own things and sort of secede their own areas of land. Is there any sort of way you can envision people being allowed to secede? Like, say, you mentioned anarchists just living in the woods. So what if some anarchists do stumble upon some property, some unclaimed land, call it their own? Do they have the right to just be anarchists on their own property and their own system? Or should everyone be sort of under the reign of some sort of government?
It depends. I mean, should Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan be allowed to secede so that they can institute Sharia law?
Right. No, and I think that's the important distinction to make, is that
right.
At least to me, no one should be sort of not subject to natural law, so to justice. I mean, if someone just acquires property and starts a child slave farm, well, I'm sorry, we don't just say, oh well, they're on their own property. You still have the right to go in and stop violations of rights, no matter where they're occurring. In my view,
you sound like Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, you're gonna get me in trouble, Austin.
Yeah, well, that's what I like to do, is to think outside the box, because unfortunately too many anarchists are so inconsistent in their philosophy that they think that they believe that they say they believe in natural rights, but they don't want to enforce them. To the problem with anarchists is that the NAP is optional, right? There's no requirement to enforce these beliefs that they say they believe in deeply. And to me, if you actually believe in the NAP, those laws should be enforced.
Awesome. Before I let you go, I just want to get your opinion really quickly on just a few topics that have been, I guess, points of discussion among libertarians recently. Why don't we start with a controversial figure like yourself in many ways, Mr. Rand Paul. What's your opinion on him?
Oh, I'm a big fan of Rand. He's not a perfect candidate. I didn't like it. Like, if I was going to criticize him, I'd say I didn't like his whole moral crisis. Gay marriage is a moral crisis. So I'd probably, slap him on the butt for that. But other than that, I mean, you saw his filibuster against the NSA. You saw his filibuster on the unilateral use of drones to execute American citizens by the executive branch. That shows to me that guy has got our best interests at heart, and he's my number one pick when it comes to the presidential race. That's for sure.
What about Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht? Do you feel that Silk Road should be and Ross Ulbricht should be praised as they are by many libertarians for, I guess, creating this wonderful online drug marketplace, or do you think that there are some problems with associating libertarianism with that?
I mean, there's obviously problems with associating libertarianism with it, but it doesn't mean that I disagree with it. It's just because something cosmetically is inappropriate doesn't mean that it's appropriate overall. Again, my arguments about like the cosmetic problems of anarchists, the ones that don't wear deodorant and stuff like that, is simply that they aren't able to advance their principles if you can't stand within 5 feet of them without smelling, horribly. But when it comes to Ross Ulbricht, yeah, it is a problem, but there's more positives in some sense than there are negatives. So you got to weigh the pros and cons on this one. He actually made the drug trade safer in the sense that he took out the third party, the drug dealer that would necessarily lead to violence if there was ever a dispute. So because any disputes could be handled directly through the darknet, that was a safer way to handle problems, and it was always caveat emptor, which I am for. Now, when it comes to the accusations about him, calling out a hit on certain people, I haven't been able to independently verify that he did that, or that he wasn't led on or goaded by the FBI agents to perform to call for that. But even if that were true, the problem is the government makes it illegal, so he has no way to protect himself or his products or his marketplace. So he was acting in his own self-interest because he couldn't call the police. He couldn't call the legitimate police to protect him and his interests. He had no authority to do so. And in Ancapistan, that's legal, right? Of course. If we lived in the anarcho-capitalist paradise, if somebody was threatening my interests, I could just call out a hit on their head, and that would be totally legitimate, right?
Well, isn't that the problem then? I mean, that's the problem to me with vigilante justice.
That's correct. That is the problem, and that is why anarchy doesn't work.
And to me, that's the problem with promoting black markets like Silk Road, not as concepts that they're bad, but to promote them as a strategy for liberty, because that's not our ideal world. Our ideal world shouldn't be one where we live in the black. Our ideal world should be one where we're all open in the light of day, where transactions can take place out in the open, and where we don't need to have people that think they need to hire assassins to protect their stuff, where they can actually go to some sort of system. And we might disagree on how that system is formed or founded or funded or what have you, but there needs to be some sort of justice system that operates in the light of day.
Right, but even if that system was out in the open, if there was a dispute, and we lived in a system without justice, with no judicial system, then still his hits would have been legitimate, because he was possibly legitimately defending his own property and his own interests. So do you want to live in a world where it's legal to sell drugs and to call out hits on people? Because I don't. I want to live in a world where it's legal to sell drugs, but that when it comes to disputes between private property, that there is a neutral third arbiter. And that neutral third arbiter should only have just enough power to enforce contracts and to protect life, liberty, and the property of individuals.
Well, Austin, that's an excellent closing statement. So we'll wrap things up there. Before I let you go, why don't you just give everyone the full roundup of where they can find all your different websites? Obviously, they can go to libertarianrepublic.com, libertyviral.com. Just let them know where they can find everything else you're doing, including the podcast, The Freedom Report.
Sure. So the best way to get the Freedom Report podcast, you can go to iTunes, itunes.com, subscribe, get ours every single day. If you really like the show, I'd really appreciate a 5-star review on iTunes. That helps me out a lot. And if you don't, of course, you can go to Stitcher.com. It's an Android app, Stitcher.com. You can get the Freedom Report podcast and the libertarianrepublic.com. Every single day, it's your home for economic freedom and personal liberty.
Austin, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was a great conversation, and we'll talk to you again sometime soon.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Thanks, man. Take care.
Bye.
Guys, if you're anything like me and like to wear your political beliefs on your sleeve, Liberty Maniacs is there to help you literally do just that. Liberty Maniacs is an independent brand that designs and sells some of the world's favorite political and satirical apparel and merchandise. From funny political t-shirts to libertarian-minded posters, art prints, humorous mugs, and thousands of other products sold by some of the most trusted retailers, Liberty Maniacs has become a top source for liberty lovers of every stripe all across the globe, and a thorn in the side of everyone from the NSA to top politicians. And now, Lions of Liberty listeners can get 10% off your entire order by entering the referral code Lions of Liberty. That's all one word at checkout. Again, that's referral code Lions of Liberty for a 10% discount. Head to libertymaniacs.com. Wear something worth saying. I know nobody likes dealing with health insurance companies. It's bad enough that you're sick, but now, thanks to the ACA, you're forced to pay for all sorts of coverage you don't even want or need, and the odds are you are indeed paying for it. I was frustrated too until I did some research and found out about health sharing, where like-minded, health-conscious individuals get together to cover each other's medical costs. And now the fine folks at Health Excellence Select have taken it to another level with a complete healthcare service, combining health sharing with personal care assistance to help you find the doctors that you need at the best price, 24/7 phone access to physicians, along with discounts on dental and vision. And if that wasn't enough, they even have a website that works, if you can believe that. Guys, if you are struggling with a solution to your healthcare needs, look no further than Health Excellence Select. For more information, head on over to lionsofliberty.com/health. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Austin Petersen. And I know some feathers are going to be ruffled by a lot of the things that Austin Petersen says. And I don't agree with everything that he says conceptually, but I do think he does bring up some good points that are worthy of addressing. And look, I am in full agreement with the non-aggression principle 100% of the time, but simply stating non-aggression principle over and over doesn't necessarily explain a full vision of what liberty is or what libertarianism is. And frankly, I'm not even sure it's the starting point. I think it's a conclusion we can draw based on our discussion of individual rights. Now, anything that we talk about when it comes to politics has to focus around the subject of rights, because rights determine what we can and cannot do upon our fellow man when it comes to inflicting violence upon them, when it comes to interfering in their everyday actions. And when we're discussing individual rights, the natural extension of that, of having the right to take your own actions as long as they're not interfering with others, natural law, if you will, we have to therefore respect property rights. Property rights are a mere extension of individual rights, and property rights are the basis upon which individuals are allowed to form any kind of conjoining organizations, whether they want to call those governments or what have you. Now look, today's modern governments like we have now are not necessarily founded based on legitimately acquired private property. Essentially, they were founded upon fiat land grabs. People show up. I mean, the King of England pointed at the colonies and said, "These are your lands." The King of Spain pointed at certain sections and when people showed up and landed and said, "Now this is your land." Well, that's not really a just way to acquire property. You can really only acquire property if it's justly acquired consensually from someone else. Or if you're the first person to land there, the first person to start using it, and no one else has a claim upon it, well, then you can claim that land. Now, I'm getting really deep into the conception here, but I think we really have to have an idea and an understanding about how man can legitimately form governments, how man can legitimately form bodies of law and organizations to enforce natural law. Now, I don't use the same definition of government as even Austin Petersen used. Even Austin Petersen mentioned that government is sort of a coercive force. Now, if we just pull up Merriam-Webster, a pretty well-respected dictionary, and we look up the definition of government, the definition just says, a group of people who control and make decisions for a country, state, etc., a particular system for controlling a country, state, etc., or the process or manner of controlling a country, state, etc. Now, we can look at that definition and apply it to our modern times and look at modern governments and say, oh, look, these governments are coercively taxing individuals. Many people don't consent to the taxation they are getting. Many people do not consent to the regulations handed down upon them from the United States government and from other governments that act coercively towards its citizens. They'll then make the conclusion that all governments must be coercive. But if we really just take the concept of government, of governing over our own property, there's nothing in there in that definition provided by Merriam-Webster that says it must be coercive. If we look at this at the very basic level, at the idea of property, the idea of one person owning property. Now, basically this just means you can set certain stipulations regarding your property. Say, just to keep it really easy, you don't want smoking on your property. And if you have a guest on your property, you're allowed to say, you're not allowed to smoke on my property. And if someone lights up a cigarette, you're allowed to ask them to leave. Now, that doesn't mean, because they have technically aggressed upon you with the cigarette smoke, despite your objections, you can then shoot them for that. Doesn't mean that at all. I do believe there has to be some kind of proportionality when we're looking at justice, when we're looking at defense of property. But if we agree that people have the right to set rules upon their own property, then naturally, those rights should extend to multiple property owners over any amount of conjoining property that they decide to set rules upon. Now, take that one property owner, if he has 50 neighbors that all come together and say, we want to form a government, we want to form a system, a body of law that will sort of enforce the rules of our conjoined property. Now, those rules can be just simply enforcing natural law, enforcing property rights, enforcing the right to life, setting up a court system, setting up a police system. That's all fine. There's nothing that goes against anybody's rights for that. Now, many anarchists and anarcho-capitalists might argue that method is not efficient, or that it'll be better with competing defense agencies and competing justice systems. And that might be okay. People should also have the right to form systems where there are competing defense firms and competing justice systems, if that's the system they want to live in, if they're basing that on their own property. But they cannot dictate to other people that they must live in those systems either, because that would violate the rights of others. You see, man should be free to form any systems he chooses. The key is, are these systems violating people's rights? Do you have the literal consent of the governed? Now, look, this is very philosophical. You can say, well, that's That's not how our present system is. That's not how our country is. That's not how our layout is. And you would be right. But we do have to decide and look at what is right in order to even come up with our correct positions on things. And it's complicated by our present system because, the United States was not fully founded upon private property. The states were not founded on private property. So we're already starting off in a situation where it's all kind of jumbled. At the same time, there's nothing wrong with the structure of the United States government per se. There's nothing wrong with, say, cities and towns founded on private property contracting together to a state government. There's nothing wrong with those state governments contracting out to a federal government for enforcing natural law or what have you. But again, that's not how our systems are founded. So we have a bit of a problem here. And guys, I've mentioned this before, but this is kind of the reason I don't put myself in a quote-unquote minarchist camp or an anarchist camp, because really what I'm about are individual rights and using reason to achieve your positions, to have a conception of what individual rights are. And we do have to distinguish between different kinds of rights. When we're talking about natural rights, there's no positive right that can be there in terms of natural rights. Natural right is really just a negative right. A right not to be aggressed upon, a right not to be interfered with, as long as you're not interfering with others. However, when you talk about things like a right to a lawyer, a right to a trial by jury, a right to not be brought up on a charge a second time, double jeopardy, all things that we talked about with Austin Petersen here, I agree with those things in concept, and I agree. This is why we sort of do need man to form structures, to form systems of law, and many of these things come about through common law over the years. It doesn't necessarily need to be dictated top down from an authority, from an executive or what have you. But people do have the right to form systems where these things are available to its citizens to go through a justice process. I think certain things like that are absolutely vital. However, that doesn't mean that we have the right to aggress upon other people in order to fund these things. You can't just point to your neighbor on different property that hasn't agreed to any of this and say, all right, it's my right to a lawyer, it's my right to a trial by jury, you must fund it, and I'm going to attack you or assault you if you don't fund it. This is where, to me, the city-state principle, this is something I discussed with Shane Whistler back in episode 2 of this show, which we'll post in the show notes. The city-state principle is really what solves all these problems in so many ways. It's based, the idea that man can form governments literally, not figuratively, literally based on their justly acquired private property. And it's at this point, when people are forming these systems, where individuals are forming these systems, that we can come to reasonable ideas and reasonable agreements about what should entail a just system, eliminating the idea of double jeopardy, guaranteeing a right by a jury of your peers. These are positive rights, but if they're brought together by agreement, by mutual consent, well, they're perfectly good and perfectly right, and they should be standard of any actual justice system that takes place. Now, we discussed Ross Ulbricht and Silk Road, and the idea that you might say he might be justified to protect his assets in a black market, but that's really just the problem with black markets. That the only way to really protect your assets at the end of the day is to resort to violence. Now, of course, you can try to negotiate things. There's private arbitration. I'm not saying these things always must lead in violence, but at the end of the day, if you don't have some sort of system, whether that's an anarcho-capitalist sort of private competing court system, or whether that's a minarchist system that Austin Petersen sort of describes, or whether that's a system, hopefully, of mutual consent, one actually agreed upon by its citizens. The point being, if you don't have a justice system, if you don't have a system that operates in the light of day, you're going to get a where the strongest survive situation. Now, that's not my objection to anarchy, but it is my objection to black markets as a strategy for liberty. That's not the ideal world we want to present to people. A world where you have a problem with someone, so you hire a hitman to take him out. That's not a proper presentation of what liberty is or should be. Now, I have no problem with the idea of starting a website so people can get drugs, but we should be aiming for a society where that's not illegal. Not aiming for a society where we bring everything underground. In order to have justice, this stuff needs to take place out in the open. That's why I don't have pseudonyms in all these forums I discuss things on. That's why I'm not just, I'm not Mr. Liberty, I'm a guy in a mask at the other end of a microphone. That's why I'm Marc Clair, and I put my positions out there, and I discuss things openly. If we hide, and we squirrel away to foxholes in black markets, we're not advancing liberty. We're not teaching anybody anything about principles. At the end of the day, our philosophy and our positive vision of what a libertarian or a liberty-based society is the most important thing. And we do have to have these discussions. We do have to sort these things out amongst ourselves. I think it's the most important thing we can do. Because you can't really present a political ideology to the rest of the world if you can't even agree on what that is. Now, I agree, many libertarians may never actually agree at the end of the day, and we should still come together with people who share similar views to advance certain things. Like, I'm not going to give everyone a libertarian purity test to join them on legalizing marijuana, to join them on decriminalizing drugs, to join them on trying to stop aggressive wars around the world. But when it comes to parsing out our ideology, there's just nothing more important than figuring out what that ideology really should be. What is right? What is just? What is moral? I'm not saying I have the answers, but I'm going to have the conversation. I'm going to keep having that conversation with people a lot of people might disagree with, like Austin Petersen. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that agree with Austin Petersen, too. I'm a mixed bag. I think he does bring up a lot of points. I'm not going to go around calling him a statist and all this stuff that other people will just call him because he doesn't, toe that sort of dogmatic company line. But these conversations are very important. That's why I have them with Austin Petersen. That's why I have them with Tom Woods. That's why I have them with Lou Rockwell. That's why I have them with people all across the libertarian spectrum, quote unquote, if you will. Now, I guess I've rounded up today. This might be my longest post-show rant of all time. So I'm going to wrap things up really quick here. As always, I got to get my plugs in. Be sure to check out our work at lionsofliberty.com. If you like what we're doing, there are ways you can help us out. Shop through our Amazon banner. Shop over at Liberty Maniacs. Support our sponsors who support this show. And of course, tell your friends about it. Email your friends, post on your social media, help us get the word out. We have no marketing budget. You with those headphones in right now, you are our marketing budget. Or maybe you're staring at your computer. Maybe you're staring at our YouTube channel. Don't forget, we put all our podcasts up on the Lions of Liberty YouTube channel as well. You can join us on our social media, facebook.com/Lions of Liberty. Find us on Twitter at Lions of Liberty, Google+. We're pretty much all over the place, guys. Be sure to check us out on the weekends at libertytalk.fm at 6 p.m. Eastern on Saturday and Sunday, and throughout the week at the Liberty Radio Network, LRN.FM. Until next week, folks, live long and live free.